My name is Rick Hill. I'm a Tuscarora from the Six Nations of the Grand River. I work at Six Nations Polytechnic as a curriculum developer. We're going to share with you today some ideas about how to improve our practice when it comes to dispute resolution. Our main goal is to assure that more of our children stay in our community, that we have stronger families that provide a safe haven for these children, and that we use our cultural principles in order to make this all happen.
My name is Bob Antone. I'm Turtle Clan from the Oneida Nation. I'm an independent researcher and writer. And I'm here with Rick to talk about Indigenous dispute resolution and how we can effectively make some changes in our communities to without having to face or go into court systems and outside court systems and to keep our children in our communities.
Indigenous dispute resolution training, the cultural foundations of that, some of the approaches that we have to that. This first image shows the same young woman as she was dressed in her native clothing and how she's dressed today. What's the difference between the two? Well, too many of our kids have been adopted out into the mainstream society, taken away from their homes. Back in the 60s, there was a great move to try to remove as many of the kids as they could. And as a result of that, our children grew up with those kind of strange ideas about themselves. So what we're here to do today is to try to find other ways of dealing with this matter. There's a couple of big questions that we need to ask ourselves. How did we get to the point where more of our children are in care today than ever went to the residential schools in the past? And how can our traditional culture be employed to reverse this trend? What do you see to the main answers to those questions?
Main answers, I think, is that the result of the colonization, which we're going to review, and how it's caused the stress inside of our communities has impacted our ability to do good parenting in our communities. I think the residential schools had a direct impact on that. And of course, I think the culture is there, has been kind of the mainstay inside of our communities that we can still hook onto or latch onto to relearn some of those earlier traditions that have kept our families together.
We need to ask ourselves, what is culture? What does it mean? How can it be used in this manner? But sometimes we focus too much on the outward trappings of culture, dancing and singing and craft work, which is all good. But there's a deeper part of that, the values and the traditional norms, the kind of behaviors that we expect. We have some basic assumptions. That's what we're going to try to focus in on. How do we dig deeper into our culture to find those core things that everybody can relate to?
Yeah, I think what we're looking at in terms of doing Indigenous dispute resolution is coming up with what we're calling a child well-being plan, which is really a way to where we're focusing on the child, but we're focusing on the family or the extended family and trying to pull all of their ideas together to build a solution to make sure that child has a good life. This is going to be based on the culture, on community-held ethics and beliefs, and really looking at the strengths of our culture, and really as we go through this process, coming to a common understanding of our history.
What we believe is that in order for Indigenous dispute resolution to work, it has to have the necessary supports within the agency. We have to have consensus with the ministry on these matters. And our goal is to keep families together. We know that can be a very tough task, but we're able to move together by building stronger, healthy relationships.
So when you think about this task we have before us, I think as we reflect on it, one of the things we have to realize is that all of us who are Indigenous in our communities, we've all been affected by colonization, and that many of our people talk about being traumatized in residential schools or even in their homes over the last 50 years. And we have to admit that also that there are some constructive changes going on in our communities, and that we're starting to see some change, but certainly we're still at the earlier stages of that. And we have to figure out a way to become more culturally congruent with our teachings too as well, and that to ensure that those values and beliefs that we were talking about earlier, that they're somehow or they become integrated into our everyday activity.
You know, cultural congruency is a very important concept here, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I think it's important what we're saying is that the way in which we enact child welfare should be a manifestation of the culture in itself. Culture shouldn't be kind of an add-on. It's not like you're putting feathers onto something, but it's at the core of how you do business. And we're based our approach on a lot of research that's already been conducted by Indigenous people. There was a gathering down in Niagara Falls in 2005, I think it was.
Yeah.
And they identified these important elements. So this is what we already know, that truth-telling is important. That's why we want to embrace our history. And our history can be kind of dark, but we need to acknowledge this is what took place. And part of that acknowledgement is that learning about how trauma works on our people, to realize that some of our people are severely traumatized. And that some of that trauma happened generations ago, and they've inherited some of that. And then we're looking at how then do we begin to restore the humanity of the people? How do we help get through all of their pain, all of their suffering, and use our traditions in order to restore their strength? And in the end, once you have strong people, they can rebuild stronger relationships and find a way to heal from their trauma.
In those principles that come out of that conference, we were looking at one of the key ones was self-determination. And it's really our right and responsibility to make sure our communities are functioning properly and that we own the child welfare programs. And that also that culture and language is critical to our survival. We must take a holistic approach. And we have to have structured interventions in terms of our communities. They're very thoughtful interventions about how we're going to do, how we're going to engage with our families, dispute resolution, and how do we and build a system that is fair for everyone.
And sometimes it's easy to say these things. We realize it's very difficult, but we're going to explore all of these principles in the training and give you better tools of how to enact these. So it's our firm belief that our culture is the only antidote to colonized behavior. Our culture had a way of dealing with a traumatized mind, helping people out of their grief and helping to recover their humanity. But it takes time to learn these values, and we can't always just interject and assume that everybody understands them. So we need to all spend a little bit more time learning what are the deeply held cultural values in our community that can have some important role to play in resolving the matters that we face with child welfare. And for us, the ceremony becomes a part of it. We advocate that we should begin each day with whatever ceremony is appropriate for your community to not only welcome the day, bring people there, bring their minds together, because this is the way our ancestors always did that, and it's important to have a spiritual underpinning to the work that we do.
Your responsibility. So you take the shared values and weave them into a everyday practice. When you think about that, that's everyone's responsibility. That we have to become at one with our belief and our faith about our culture and our way of life, and that we have to take those beliefs and put them into practice. And Indigenous dispute resolution is one of those practices that we're talking about, that where we can use our good mind to help facilitate families through difficult times, to find solutions that are going to ensure our children have a positive future.
You know, you could say that good-mindedness is a traditional cultural principle of the Haudenosaunee people from Six Nations. What this means is that we've been given this mind and the power of reason in order to resolve things. We're not supposed to revert to violence. So it's a very old tradition. We believe that we can draw upon that to help people today, particularly families that are in trouble. So the first day of the training has these 3 different modules. The first one focuses on what are the historical factors that impact on this whole situation of Indigenous child welfare. Second, we're going to get into the meaning of ethnostress, and Bob will present more on that in a minute. And we have general presentations, and then we break into groups to have a more intimate discussion on these matters. The first discussion group will look at how can we aid families that are struggling. Now, we're not saying that we're going to provide you with all the information, because the participants also bring some experience to the table. So when we do this training, it's very interactive. You have to bring your knowledge and your understanding and your experience into play. The third module looks at the role of personal healing. Let's think of it this way. We can't help others heal if we don't heal ourselves first. And so we have to make sure that we are strong, that we believe in these principles that we're talking about, and we've used them to actually help eliminate some of the bias that we may have. The second group discussion is going to be putting our minds together to talk about personal healing and reflect on that. So this isn't just some abstract academic discussion we're talking about, but we're really going to try to help you deal with the actual matters that impact on all of us because of our colonization.
Yeah, and when you look at the overall objectives of this training, I mean, it is quite enormous in terms of what we're trying to engage in. But I think that because it looks much larger than it is, because we're taking a holistic approach, and we're combining not only experiential process and finding solutions in family disputes, but we're also, as Rick had mentioned, we're also talking about healing as well. And that I believe that, whenever groups of people come together and when they're engaging these kinds of topics that are trauma based, that there's always some element of healing that goes on in that. And I think that this is all captured in these objectives. The ceremony, the medicines, all of that are going to be a part of the process too. We believe very much that ceremony is a part of our life. I mean, even our life is a ceremony, and that traditional foods are a part of what heals our families when they gather together. So all of these things are going to be integrated into this process.
We define a number of learning outcomes that are in the training manual, and we'll be going over these as we go through this stuff. Like Bob mentioned, there's a lot to cover. There's a lot what we expect of this training, but I think only together can we get this thing done. A lot of you will already have some core understanding, some techniques that'll help with each other. So as we go through these things, we're going to share a lot of information from you from our point of view, from what the current research says, what current best practices are, and these learning outcomes will reflect that as we go through the training. It's a 4-day training, and the first day we focus a lot on the foundations of that.
One of the issues we talked about was being culturally congruent, and there are actually historically 4 things that we've always mentioned about cultural awareness, cultural sensitivity, cultural competency, cultural safety, and cultural congruence. Congruence is when an agency is allowing the culture to integrate right into the organization. And it's a part of the decision making, it's a part of the policy making, it's a part of how programs are designed and delivered with cultural thought. It's all of that, and it creates a safe environment. And I think that's one of the things that's really important, is that the agency itself has to represent that culture in that way, so that people who are coming into it, and for some people, it'll be the first time they'll engage in a culture, and so they're going to have to feel that sense of safety. And we look at these 4 things around cultural safety, the awareness, as I mentioned, sensitivity, competency, and congruency. All of those are critical to ensuring that people are learning the best from the culture. As I had mentioned, there are many of our people who have very limited experiences with our culture. And of course, and we also have the people who have maybe an in-depth knowledge of the culture and have some restrictions around it as well. So we're trying to balance all of that, and I think every agency needs to do that, so that everyone is comfortable no matter from what end of the spectrum they come from. So what does it look like and feel like in terms of cultural congruent child welfare? That's a really important question, and certainly everyone will have a chance to take a look at that. And what needs to be present, I think that language, song, tradition, and the ability, and someone with the ability to explain what we're talking about, even when we're talking about Ganigolio or the good mind, there has to be someone there who can explain those things, and that's what we're recommending that we provide during these sessions.
Our curriculum is based upon the notion that every community will develop their own aspect of this. Some of them already have them. And so there's no one answer that fits all scenarios, all cultures, all communities. But we need to look at these questions and draw from our culture to come up with a pattern that can be used. So we're going to be workshopping these ideas. Every time we gather together, new things will come out of that, and we'll add that to the overall picture of how to improve our child welfare practice. So the first module is looking at the historical factors that impact on Indigenous child welfare. Basically, it's going to be explaining what took place and how colonization weakened our families. And we will be able to gain a broader understanding of the historic factors that produce the societies that we live in today. We talk about coming to this common history. This is a part of that.
When you hear the word colonization, what kind of things come to mind? And certainly history, certainly, like residential schools, the 60s scoop, all of those things that have truth and reconciliation. Those are all kind of like buzzwords today, but in a way that they pinpoint some of the critical things that have happened to us. And we have another example, too, of all the forces that are coming at us yet today. The historical factors that we struggle with are the ethno-stress, of course, and the intergenerational trauma. We still have a lot of colonial attitudes. Some of it is the racism that we experience. And these create emotional scars in our communities that we're struggling with. And I think it's important for us to really understand, like even these four elements, to a point where we're able to explain that to families who are struggling to understand what's going on in their lives. And they're able to ask this question: what happened to our families? Historically, there's lots of evidence out there to explain that.
One time we had a complete culture, a complete cultural safety net, a long-term family plan, all of these things. It was our people lived in harmony and flow with the cycles of nature. So everything was provided there when you think about all the medicines and that. So our ancestors had a great plan, and this is what colonization upset. Even though today we can still follow our ceremonies, as this chart shows, our society has been disrupted because of this. Maybe you could share a few of the ideas of how that took place.
Yeah, when you look at this chart on weapons of colonization, I call it the alcohol, Christianity, disease, Western music, gambling, distractions of the mind, and even their law. All of these are elements that we're told in our stories that were our instruments of how to control the Indian, and we've had that experience. And as a result of that colonization, we see this ethno-stress in our community, which is really, ethno-stress is really a discussion about the disruption of our original indigenous joy. And what we see is these symptoms of self-hatred, the lack of positive identity, lateral violence that goes on in our communities, risky behaviors, irresponsibility, and turning to mind changers to find some kind of relief from the stress that they're experiencing. We become fully aware of the fear and anger and hopelessness that exists in our communities. We try to reach out to each other. We turn our backs on our traditions sometimes. We seek solutions in wrong places, and we disconnect from the sacred places. And we feel uncomfortable in our own skin as Indigenous people. So when you look at this, these forces that are still coming at us today, our communities are surrounded by a number of elements that are coming at us, whether it's the Indian Act or CAS or, just reading around the chart, you look at everything that our people depend on today comes from the outside. Even our foods comes from the outside markets. Even our school systems and all of that. Even though we may be going to school in here, but the curriculum is pretty much controlled from the outside. I mean, these are just examples of what we're having to deal with in terms of the forces of colonization. So colonization has weakened our knowledge of and practice of our culture, but there are still strong practices available to us, and that's what we want to take the best of our practices that are available to us and integrate them into an Indigenous dispute resolution process. So when you look at this question, next question, what does decolonizing mean to you? A very important question, because once you understand colonization, you have to figure out, okay, well, how do I get out of this mess? How do I improve my life, and how do I make things different for myself and my family?
But there, there's two kinds of decolonization too taking place. One with ourselves, with our own lives and our communities. But the Western institutions also have to decolonize. Some of those cultural patterns that caused the problem are still there. Some of the cultural or racist bias. So we're talking about two processes that go along here. In many ways, then, Indigenous dispute resolution isn't the alternative to the mainstream. It's the thing that we believe is possible. And the mainstream provides the alternative. So part of it is a perspective on how we get there.
One of the things that we're going to do around is we're going to do a case study on a family who is struggling, and we'll take a look at that how this kind of process can help families, and that during the training we'll use this model and show how it's done as our first approach.
I think the difficulty here is that we know a lot of our families are been traumatized or whatever have took place, and sometimes it's really hard to get the parents talking together, and because we're a small community, extended family. So we have some techniques and practices that we're going to share with you, and I'm sure you may have some as well, as to how do we get people who aren't getting along, get back talking to each other. Here's where we believe tradition can be a great support, because there's great stories, there's great practices that help our young people in particular learn to speak to each other respectfully.
In another one, in Module 3, we're going to be talking about the role of personal healing in the IDR process, and this is probably the more experiential part of the program, and I think that it's what sets it apart. Indigenous dispute resolution, it sets it apart from the mainstream process, is that we believe that families can be helped in this process of dialoguing with each other, a way of healing some of the wounds and hurts that they're feeling, and then you couple that with the knowledge and the historical factors. It helps individuals go through a process of self-awareness and in becoming more sensitive about themselves and what has happened to them. And in the end, there's a level of healing that they can achieve.
Plus, we'll talk about the role of traditional healers. There's a wide array of what that means in our communities, but it's important, I think, to have other people express an interest that the family in trouble, finding ways to use their culture to mend the wounds of the past and heal their relationships so they can be strong, all again for the sake of the child. In our case, we have this one, what's called Wiping the Tears Protocol. It goes back to the foundation of our governance. Basically, it says that when a mind is suffering grief, three basic things need to take place. And this used to be a ceremony that we performed whenever we met, whether it was between Indigenous people, and then when the colonizers arrived too, we also engaged in this ceremony. And basically, it talks about how to unburden our mind. The first thing we have to do is wipe each other's tears, because when we're suffering grief, you can't see well. Tears cloud your eye, and everything was kind of bleak. So we take the time to wipe the tears to say we understand that you're having this grief, but we're also saying, there's a great day coming. There's a reason to uplift your mind. The second is then we try to uplift their spirit. Our ancestors used as a soft feather to clean out your ears, symbolically cleaning out your ears, because when you're suffering grief, you don't hear people. In fact, you kind of push them away. So we want you to hear our kind, empowering words. Now, there's a great speech that goes with each one of these that we're going to share during the training, but this is a way of thinking about how can we help uplift people's mind, uplift their spirit, and then refresh their body. And the third protocol would be to take water as a medicine and have it wash down their throat to restore their voice. So when you think about it, if you're suffering grief and your mind is in turmoil, or you get depressed, your vision has been blurred because you can't see straight anymore. You're so angry or you're hurt. And the third, you've lost your voice. You don't know how to express yourself, and you're probably not eating very well. But the simple protocol helped to restore people so that we could engage in a conversation with each other. So what we're going to be asking you during this training is what has worked for you? What traditions do you use? What do you draw upon? Reflecting on the experiences that Bob and I are going to share with you. What does work? But also looking at what didn't work. Try to understand that as well. So we want to be able to be pragmatic about this. What are some of the actual things that you can do that draw from our culture, that have a deep meaning, but that also can have a profound impact? So as we go through this training, we're going to learn this over the next 4 days as to what works best, how to improve something that you're already trying. But maybe something didn't work. Maybe we can go back and bring that and dust it off a little bit and find a way to make it work.
The next round we'll be talking about gathering our minds on in terms of personal healing. What do you need to do to decolonize your own thinking? I think is really a big question that the healing process is talking about. When you look at family violence, which is what dispute resolution is trying to resolve, because you look at the care of a child is about the care of a spirit. A child is a human spirit that needs to be nurtured and cared for and loved in a way that as adults, I mean, we progress through our development to be able to know that and understand that. But in this process, we're talking about families who are struggling with those very issues of how do you care and take care of each other. And I think that's an important part of the work that we need to do in this process. It's coming to some kind of understanding around that.
So in the first day, we're going to take you from this big, broad journey back through history. What happened to our families? How did we get to the situation where we're at? What are some of the cultural protocols and principles been used to help restore the humanity and the safety of our families? And then we take a deep look at ourselves and say, okay, how can we begin to decolonize those behaviors, eliminate some of those biases that we've inherited so that we can truly be of service to all people? So today's journey is going to be a very emotional journey as well, because we have to look seriously at ourselves. And together then I think we can build our strength, which is a very old traditional pattern.